This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Child marriages are on the increase. A new report says girls in Africa are now more likely to be married off than they were 5 years ago. A report by Plan International, a humanitarian organization, attributes the escalation of this practice to prolonged drought, the global coronavirus pandemic, and the conflict in Ukraine. These, in turn, have pushed up the cost of living. In some poor African households, young girls are now traded as commodity. So just how bad is the situation in Africa? And what can be done to end the saga of Africa's child brides? I'm Beatrice Marshall. Welcome to Talk Africa. Early child marriages in Africa have shot up by 51% in a year due to the ongoing hunger crisis, Plan International says in its latest report. Dowry payment has become an important source of income for families, pushing many girls out of school. In Ethiopia and Mali, school closures have witnessed a dramatic rise in child marriages. Communities still steeped in culture and traditions believe marrying off girls early is a way of tackling food insecurity and easing the social burden on families. Frequent pregnancies, birth complications, maternal and infant deaths are risks that girls face in early marriage. They are removed from school, lack decision-making powers, and are at an increased risk of intimate partner violence. In South Sudan, some girls who do not want to get married have run away from home, leaving them vulnerable to sexual exploitation. Well, joining me now is Karen Heisler, Regional Child Protection Advisor for UNICEF in West and Central Africa Regional Office. She's joining us from Dakar via Zoom. Karen, thank you for joining us on the program. Now, UNICEF has a mandate to safeguard the rights of all children everywhere. You're the Regional Child Protection Advisor for UNICEF in West and Central Africa Regional Office. What worries you the most about the rights of children in the region and across sub-Saharan Africa today?
So thank you very much for having me. What's worrying us at UNICEF, and me in particular, are the polycrises. And we're talking about this in terms of multiple, simultaneous, and interconnected shocks that are playing out in adverse ways on children's rights. And one way in which the polycrisis is having an adverse impact is on child marriage. West and Central Africa is home to the largest numbers of child brides globally, with over 60 million brides out of a global number of 650 million and 130 million in Africa. So this is a particular concern for us. It's also a concern for us because across the Sahel, which cuts across a large swath of this region, we're seeing that girls are getting married on average 2 years younger than girls outside that region. And that's just a proxy for the really deep and dire deprivations of children's rights and girls' rights in particular that we're seeing right now.
So you're talking about the whole idea of child brides and you know, children are getting married younger now than before. And external data is actually suggesting that child marriages across sub-Saharan Africa has increased by 51% in a year. Why is the problem increasing?
So we're seeing a mix of interconnecting factors, and that's why I use that term polycrisis. On the one hand, we're seeing still the devastating effects of COVID. We don't see that households have been able to recover from poverty that they experienced as a result of those lockdowns. We're also seeing an increase in some parts of sub-Saharan Africa in violent conflict, and that's also impacting on the ability of governments to provide prevention and preventive social services. We're also seeing in some parts of the region schools closing as a result of conflict. And then we also have to talk about climate change because many of the countries in this region are heavily affected by climate change and their systems are not necessarily at this stage climate resilient. So these three aspects are really interplaying in tricky ways. We also talk about not only food and famine, but a learning crisis as well as a protection crisis. And again, one is seeing in these rates of child marriage really how girls are paying the brunt of a number of these areas that affect communities and individuals' ability to thrive and provide the dignity and support for their families, but also at the level of the government service provision, where we're not being able to see that in some cases they're able to provide that, and in some cases they're retreating.
So we're seeing, we're talking about the issues that are exacerbating the situation, but are there mechanisms in place to try and stem the tide or to try and deal with these challenges?
Yes, in fact, we see a number of very positive developments. One, increasingly across this region, and including in some of the humanitarian contexts, we're seeing a great increase in cash plus. So really looking at social protection programs that can reach families in need. And generally what we see there, and I can give the example in Benin of a cash plus care program that's reaching vulnerable families, that the evidence shows that those families that are reached are more likely to keep their girls in school. They're less likely to have children engaged in exploitative child labor. We're also seeing diminishing rates of interpersonal violence. And we're also just seeing, in general, better food security for those families. And that's also an important protective factor, not only for the immediate needs of those children, but also for their development and the intergenerational transmission of poverty, which we're really trying to break. We're also seeing in particular parts a lot more efforts to strengthen the quality and accessibility of schools. And I can give an example of Ghana, where there's a lot of work being done, particularly for girls who are at risk of child marriage, to be reached with a program that provides dedicated support for them to stay in school for the junior school and also to progress into secondary school. And in some cases, these are girls who have dropped out of school because of pregnancy, or they're at risk of dropping out of school. And really the school system, the education system, is really trying to help them.
Right, yes, of course. The whole question of food insecurity, because clearly food insecurity is having a major impact on whether the child stays in school or gets married early. But the most food insecure countries as well, according to studies, including from one latest one from Plan International, are showing that there's a lot of gender inequality here. How do girls in rural Africa experience food insecurity, for instance?
Yeah, and I think this is where, as you're saying, we can't separate food insecurity or food crises from learning crises and protection crises. So in some of these rural areas, girls are experiencing it in a number of ways. One, at the level of the family, when the family has higher rates of poverty, and we realize and we have to appreciate that parents are being put into positions where they have to make very, very difficult decisions. In some cases, they're making the decision to have their child married as a protective measure. They're thinking that with her being in another family, she may be able to get more support. They're also thinking of their own family, where there may be one less mouth to feed. We're also seeing in this context where there's food and famine, and also these countries are also experiencing the effects of climate change, those types of work that girls and women tend to do, like going to fetch water, going to fetch firewood, might be more complicated because they're having to travel longer distances, where they're at increased risk of sexual and gender-based violence. And in some cases, families may also see that getting their daughter married may be a protective mechanism for the increased risk that those girls may have of some other type of violence. The other thing is that we know that we're in the midst of a learning crisis, and we know that the Transforming Education Summit that was held at a high level last year, and for which we saw huge interest and leadership from across Africa and governments, is recognizing that we need to address this. When parents do not necessarily see the value of sending their girls to school because they're not seeing that they're increasing, that they're developing the learning competencies, they may also be more likely to encourage or to not support their girls to stay in school longer. So we also see that, but on the other side, we do see that when parents do see the value of education, when they see that girls do get a quality school and it's a safe school, they are more likely to keep those girls in school.
So this needs a concerted effort, though, Karen, because, from the community level, from the family structure, from the government, and even from international organizations such as yours, just not to pass the buck here, but where is the failure? Where does the buck stop?
So I often describe some of these areas in child protection, such as child marriage, as really being a proxy for a lot of gaps in other systems and services. Because if we were to have families living with an adequate standard of living, not living in poverty, we would see already a tremendous decrease in child marriage. Similarly, if all schools and the school systems as a whole were gender transformative, were safe spaces, we would also see more children there. And we know that schooling is a protective factor against child marriage, just as is poverty. Also, if we saw the health system and health services being more proactive with young mothers, particularly those mothers that may in fact be girls themselves, that can also be a way to break the intergenerational cycle of poverty, but also child marriage. I think at the end of the day, there's still a lot to be done around addressing gender inequity, and we're seeing that play out in different ways. I'd like to share that last September during the UN General Assembly, there was a side event on child marriage, and it brought together ministers from the 5 countries with the highest burden of child marriage globally. And that included 3 countries in Africa, including 2 in West and Central Africa. And from this region, it was Nigeria and the DRC. And those ministers recognized and pledged that they need to do more in their countries on economic growth that's in favor of girls and women, that really invests in families and invests much more in social protection to break that intergenerational transmission of poverty. They also recognized that there had to be a lot more done on labor market and labor market policies to make it a safe place for women to work, but also to make sure that for those women with young children, that there is some type of compensation for those who are also taking care of the household and the domestic care of the household. We also saw in that particular meeting that there was a lot of emphasis put on quality of education, and particularly at the secondary level. We've made huge strides in getting children in and passing through primary school, but there's a massive investment that's required in the secondary school across the board. And again, underpinning all of this, again, comes back to investing in approaches and so on that are gender transformative and that really recognize the potential for girls as well as boys in those changes, and that does much more to invest and empower them.
Karen Heisler, thank you very much for joining us on the program. Well, we're going to take a short break now, and when we come back, we look at what Uganda is doing to make girls less vulnerable to early marriage and how organizations like Plan International can help. Welcome back to Talk Africa. Now, before the break, we looked at the situation of the girl child in Africa in the face of widespread famine and what UNICEF is doing to help keep girls in schools. Well, joining me now to offer more insights on the increasing and worrying trend of child marriages in Africa from Kampala, Dr. Nakafero Angela, the Commissioner for Gender and Women Affairs at the Ministry of Gender and Social Development in Uganda. And in Nairobi, Anne Njuguna, the Regional Disaster Risk Management Specialist, Middle East and Eastern Africa at Plan International. Thank you both very much for joining us on the program. And if I may start off with you, according to a new research by Plan International, girls and young women are at greater risk of gender-based violence as a result of global food shortages, the conflict in Ukraine, and economic shocks. First of all, tell us more about these findings.
Thank you, Beatrice. Indeed, I want to confirm that, as we all know, pre-existing inequalities and gender norms are usually compounded much more when there is a crisis, and this drought is no different. So these findings have found that girls are becoming invisible victims of the combination of climate crisis, economic crisis, conflict, both at local level and across different countries. And about 50 million people right now are at the brink of starvation. So you can only start to imagine how the girls are impacted and how they are lost in that number. Plan International report is actually titled Beyond Hunger. And because while we know that the world is at the grip of this crisis, which is escalating, the global hunger crisis, which is escalating, and as I said, affecting more than 50 million people, what we do not always see highlighted enough is how that hunger is impacting different people differently. And so how girls become, at their age, become so invisible, and how they are affected so differently because of their gender and at the age they are at. Consequently, they are going to be the ones that are going to probably be married out early to remove that one more mouth from the basket of the home, and also to bring in some income, maybe in form of dowry. So we see that girls are also will be married off. Sometimes they also, sacrifice, and they're also, bringing in a bit of income through maybe, transactional sex, commercial sex, just to be able to complement what is happening at home. So that impact is more on girls than on boys, as looking at them from a perspective of children, yes.
Let me bring in Dr. Nakafero here. As a commissioner, though, responsible for gender issues, Dr. Nakafero, what are your thoughts on the situation of young girls in Africa today, particularly in Uganda, under the prevailing economic climate?
Thank you very much. Really, the plight of the girls, I think we need to look at both the positives and the negatives. And I would like to start with the positives of what's happening in Uganda. We are seeing more girls participating in accessing their right to education. Uganda is one of the countries where we are implementing universal primary education as well as universal secondary education, and we've have parity in terms of access to primary education as well as access to, in fact, enrollment in secondary education. So that is positive on part of the country. And we also see their survival is improving over time, though not the best, because quite a number of girls are dropping out of school, but it has been improving. When we reflect on some of the health indicators, we also note that infant mortality has reduced, maternal mortality has also reduced, and that has a lot of implication for the well-being of the adolescent girls, even young girls. We are having a challenge in terms of adolescent fertility rate, which is at 111 per 1,000. This is extremely high for us. And of course, part of the issues is what Anne is talking about. Sexual violence against young girls in Uganda is extremely high. And we also witness cultural norms and practices where we're celebrating child marriage. And of course, it's not good on our side. We have practices like female genital mutilation in certain parts of our country. And automatically, once the girl is mutilated, it's an entry into marriage. So those parts of the country where female genital mutilation is practiced, really child marriage is extremely high.
What is it, how do you strengthen the system, though? What is it that is hampering the full implementation here of the law? What is it that needs to be done to deter a lot of these issues that you're talking about? What is your biggest challenge?
Well, a number of factors deter effective implementation of our laws and policies. Quite often you find that people are not reporting, even the girls may not report. And once cases are not reported, then it's really very difficult in terms of addressing these crimes. Then secondly, we also have a challenge where some of these negative social norms, much as they've been prohibited by the law, people feel that is part of their identity. For instance, when I talk about female genital mutilation, when you go to the Pokots in Karamoja, they feel that is part of their identity and they must do it. So we need to engage them in terms of transforming the social norms and practices. They've reached an extent of crossing over to Kenya to really perform female genital mutilation. So because they feel that is part of their identity,
right,
as Pokots, they are not ready to give way to these negative social norms and practices. So as we approach the response in terms of enforcing the law, we also need to go another way of working with them in terms of accepting the changes that are ushered in by the law, but also ensuring that they're able to accept the changes as demanded by the law.
All right.
So engaging them in social norm change is critical, and we are doing this by engaging the cultural leaders, the elders among the Pokos and the Sabines. We are also approaching them from the religious and social perspective.
Right. So, Anne, you know, under international law, all girls throughout the world enjoy a variety of rights. And there's been a relentless focus on empowerment and development of young women and girls over the decades. Why are we still talking about this issue 10, 20, 30, 40 years later?
I think there are a number of reasons. Yeah, I think number one, the gains that we have made, for example, the gains we have made now are really getting eroded, you know, by the current crisis where we are having this hunger crisis. The implementation of the law also hasn't been equally implemented. I think for me, every time we talk about you know, having policies and having laws in place, we need to have a gendered approach, where every time we are allocating resources, we ensure that we are considering girls and how they are differently impacted by the different societal issues. For example, we have the education in Kenya. We have free education for all, but we still find that girls are still not accessing education as much as more boys. The transition levels still remain low. So just identifying what are those issues, how do we ensure that it's not only, you know, availing the process
right,
and availing the services, but also looking at the underlying issues that make these girls not claim and not take or access the services, the roles, the rights, and so on and so forth. So there is a lot of work to be done to socialize this at different levels, and this does not come without resource allocation. So we need to look at what is it that is making the girl child disadvantaged, even as we budget, even as we approach our implementation, as we set our policies, operationalize those policies in a way that, you know, the girls section is put aside, not only just putting policies and saying we have access, girls will have access and they will have these rights in place. That in itself, and also as Dr. Nakafero has said, the role of men and boys is very critical. That somehow is also usually a driver of what the girls, the decisions that the girls will make.
right.
We know that just talking about empowering women and girls alone will not give them the space. The men and the boys behind must be willing to hold the girls and the women's hands for us to be able to reach where we want to go.
Right. Dr. Nakafero, from a policy perspective, why are we still talking about this issue 20 years later or 30 years later?
Well, quite a number of issues still prevail. Poverty, yes, it has been reducing in Uganda, but still we have an issue at the prevalence of poverty at 21%. We don't take that lightly. Yes, the government of Uganda has enacted several laws and formulated several policies, but the social norms have not transformed in tandem with the laws and policy provisions. So we need to find ways of transforming our our social norms to accommodate gender equality and women's empowerment, especially the rights of our young people. In Uganda, we still have a challenge of corruption.
Mm-hmm.
As people report, we have gaps in terms of enforcement of the laws because of issues of corruption. And of course, even people's attitudes have not changed in tandem with the legal and policy provisions. So we still have a lot of work, as Anne is emphasizing, especially dealing with the mindset change of our people at all levels.
Right. So, and from where you sit, though, and if you were to look 10 years and beyond, if this issue is to be resolved, what would you say are the key tenets that would need to be implemented to resolve this issue once and for all?
I think there need to be, honestly, we need to work together at different level, multi-sector, multi-agency, led by the government. We need to ensure that our efforts are adding to each other and that we all interpret and understand the law properly. But ultimately, I think we need to know what are the root causes and how do we work with the local community to address these issues. So, because however much we work on the policies, on the legal framework, without addressing the root causes and without working with the community and without working with the girls to take the lead and to be able to realize their rights, just know them and the community know them, I think we would take slightly longer. But yeah, we need to address the root causes and work with the stakeholders, especially at the community level, to address the root causes.
All right. So I'm going to get your final comments, both of you. And I'll start off with you, Dr. Nakafero. As you wind up, as you give us your final comment, where do you think the failure is and where does the buck stop?
Poverty is an area which has to be eradicated. And in particularly so women's economic empowerment, then social norm transformation is very important for us. But also in terms of really stopping corruption within service delivery in Uganda is important for us.
All right. Anne, your view, where is the failure and where do you think the buck must stop?
I think I totally agree with Dr. Nakafero. You know, poverty being the root cause and the underlying social norms are really the biggest drivers of this. But I must say that, you know, at the different levels of stakeholders, we also need to take a commitment. So this is not our one person responsibility or one level responsibility. This is a responsibility at the different levels by all stakeholders. We need to be ensured that once we have whatever legal frameworks we have, once we have interventions, we are having the girls considered and how differently they need to be, their problems need to be addressed. When it comes to the current drought, you know, as per this report, we know that unless this hunger is solved, the issues affecting women, the issues affecting girls, especially girls, may go actually to full blown. We may have girls really hardest hit, and at one point we may just erode any gain that we have been able, you know, to gain. So I think for me is to call for all stakeholders to just ensure that we hold hands, we complement each other, we truly understand what the issues are, and we commit especially funding for this response if we want the girls in the affected regions actually to survive it.
All right, to you both, thank you so much for being a part of this discussion and for your insights on the plight of the girl child. But that's all we have time for on this edition of Talk Africa. A big thank you to our guest, Dr. Angela Nakafero, the Commissioner for Gender and Women Affairs in the Ministry of Gender and Social Development in Uganda, and Anne Njuguna, Regional Disaster Risk Management Specialist, Middle East and Eastern Africa at Plan International. Remember, you can be a part of this conversation online through our social media handles on Facebook and Twitter. You can also catch the show on our YouTube playlist. Do keep the conversation going and join us again next week for more Talk Africa. From me, Beatrice Marshall, and the team here in Nairobi. Until next time, bye-bye.